Hi and welcome to today's episode. We are revisiting the most brutal and fatal moment the world has ever seen. This moment is not a war, not a conflict, but a scientific discovery. It's the creation of the atomic bomb. What happens when science meets war and destruction, and no one stops what's coming? This is what today's lesson is about. But this isn't just a history lesson. It's a story about ambition, fear, power, and the price of progress. We're gonna explore this story through two powerful lenses. The first is Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's cinematic dive into the real-life Manhattan Project, and Watchmen, a graphic novel that reimagines the Cold War with a radioactive twist. Fact and fiction, history and myth. But both stories ask the same haunting questions. How far can science go? Who decides what's justified? And who lives with the fallout? Let's begin with the history.
In the early 20th century, physics was making radical progress and more steps forward. Quantum mechanics and nuclear fission were invented, and science started challenging the natural order of the universe. However, what began as a pure scientific curiosity, a discovery, a pursuit of knowledge, quickly turned into a race for survival. At a time when World War II was raging and fears that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic bomb had become concrete, the US anticipated actions and launched the Manhattan Project in 1942. The Manhattan Project was a secret military research initiative which brought together over 130,000 of the greatest physicists and scientists the world has ever seen. Among these physicists was J. Robert Oppenheimer, a man that history always remembered as a brilliant, philosophical, and deeply introspective mind, and most importantly, it remembered him as the father of the atomic bomb. And if you've never heard about the father of the atomic bomb, you've surely come across Christopher Nolan's masterpiece Oppenheimer, that introduces us to Robert Oppenheimer in a very artistic way. Apart from the fact that the movie was a success back in 2023 when it came out, the film Oppenheimer provides a powerful narrative revolving around the creation of the first atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, who was played by Cillian Murphy, was tasked by the US government in the mid-40s with leading the development of the most destructive weapon ever conceived. In the film, Nolan not only captures just the scale of this creation, but the moral horrors that followed the implementation of the Manhattan Project for the very first time. Throughout the movie, we as an audience follow very carefully the process of building the bomb, but it's not just a documentary about building the bomb. The movie also provides a huge portrayal of Oppenheimer's character that was consumed by the knowledge of what it means to create such a weapon. He's definitely not portrayed as a villain, but as completely the opposite, as a tragic figure that even inspires pity at a certain point. Nolan represented him as a man torn between his scientific genius on the one hand and his conscious and human guilt on the other. But why such guilt? The bomb was tested for the very first time in July 1945 in the New Mexico desert. Just 1 month later, it was dropped on Hiroshima, and then on Nagasaki. Over 100,000 civilians were instantly killed, and many more would suffer from the long-term consequences of radiation in the years that followed. World War II ended soon after, but the world entered a new and more dangerous era, the nuclear age. An age where cities could vanish with the press of a button, where power was no longer measured by armies but by kilotons. So here's the question. Was the bomb necessary to end the war and save lives, or was it a show of force, and especially to the Soviet Union? Well, this is where the movie Watchmen steps in to ask the same questions in a different way. So to put you in context, Watchmen is a graphic novel set during the Cold War, which later was adapted by Zack Snyder into a film in 2009. One of the key characters is Dr. Manhattan, who was played in the film by Billy Crudup. He was initially John Osterman, a nuclear scientist who basically gained superpowers after suffering a lab accident. He becomes insanely powerful. He sees time all at once and kind of loses touch with his humanity. His whole existence becomes only about immense power, total detachment, and the constant threat of wiping everything out. And this is exactly the metaphor of the atomic bomb. Dr. Manhattan becomes the bomb. He is the very embodiment of nuclear power. He is logical, he's nearly a god, and he's disturbingly detached from emotion. The US government turns him into a living weapon. And just like Oppenheimer's bomb, His mere presence changes global politics because nations start fearing his power. So yes, nations behave not out of trust, but out of fear. And both the comic and the film adaptation of Watchmen show us the world where peace is maintained for sure, not thanks to cooperation, but because of the threat of annihilation. Does that sound familiar? Well, that's the real post-1945 world order. As Dr. Manhattan grows more powerful, he grows more distant as well. He doesn't sleep, he doesn't eat, and he barely feels. He's exhausted by humanity's flaws. And when asked to stop an impending nuclear war, his response is chilling. He says, "Why should I even save a world I no longer feel connected to?" Dr. Manhattan definitely becomes a god who has lost all empathy. And maybe that's the only way we can cope with the horror of nukes, only by imagining they were created by someone inhuman, someone incapable of truly understanding the consequences. But in real life, Oppenheimer was all too human. In one of his interviews after the first nuclear test, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita. This line isn't about power, but rather about sadness, fear, sorrows, and also the late realization that his success also created a catastrophe. And here, something comes to my mind and makes me ask, if Oppenheimer never invented the bomb, if none of what happened in 1945 ever happened, would humanity not have somehow discovered nuclear power? Would it not have used it somehow? Well, it would probably have, because science has no limits. The bomb wasn't even in Oppenheimer's hands anymore when Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed. He created, but didn't give the order. And yet he felt responsible. Yes, that burden of creating something that could destroy everything haunted him for the rest of his life. At times, he tried to justify it when he appeared in public. "I'm sure the Japanese didn't like it," he once said. The crowd was applauding his genius. But behind his words, the film shows us his nightmares. He dreams of the burnt bodies. He's torn between applause and terror. Just like Dr. Manhattan, Oppenheimer becomes a symbol of moral dissociation, a man floating between praise and horror, caught in the tangle of scientific legacy and human suffering. And in Watchmen, the paradox becomes even darker. In the story's climax, millions are sacrificed in a staged catastrophe to prevent nuclear war. The logic is utilitarian. The loss of millions to save billions. But this leaves us with a question. Do we even have to destroy it in order to save? And that brings us back to today. The two characters of Oppenheimer and Dr. Manhattan, one who's real and one who's fictional, actually stand as mirrors of our scientific ambitions. The two characters of Oppenheimer and Dr. Manhattan, one who's real and one who's fictional, actually stand as mirrors of our scientific ambitions. They embody the same contradictions, the creation and destruction, the progress and peril, and the genius and guilt. They raise questions we still haven't answered. Is a scientist responsible for how their discovery is used? And is it fair to judge decisions made under the fog of war, with hindsight and moral clarity, only available decades later? And in our time, facing AI, biotechnology, and cyber warfare, are we once again racing ahead scientifically, without pausing to even ask what it all means? We still live in the shadow of 1945. Yes, that year ended one war, but began an ethical crisis that has never truly ended. We have the Cold War, the arms race, the doctrine of mutual assured destruction. It all stems from that moment when science crossed the line. Oppenheimer once said, I quote, "In some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin," end of quote. This is a sin. That burden, it's still with us. And I'll end with this question for you. In 100 years, which of today's decisions will our descendants look back on with horror? What everyday choices driven by progress or convenience might one day be viewed as irreversible mistakes? Are we building a future that will save us or doom us? And are we doomed to forever live in fear?
Let us talk a little bit about fear. Not abstract fear, not political slogans, but the very real terror and tragedy that nuclear weapons etched into the lives of millions during Cold War. This is Fear and Fallout, a journey through bomb drills, presidential diaries, and black rain. Let's begin. In 1952, the United States tested the hydrogen bomb. the H bomb, more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. This weapon marked the start of a terrifying new arms race. The US wasn't just preparing for conflict, it was preparing for annihilation, and so was the Soviet Union. 2 weeks after Hiroshima, Joseph Stalin ordered the development of a Soviet atomic bomb. The race for global nuclear supremacy had just begun. Back in the US, a top secret policy paper called NSC 68 was published by the National Security Council. It called for an astronomical increase in military spending, essentially a blank check to keep pace with or dominate the Soviets. NSC 68 would go on to define American foreign policy for decades. But what did it mean for the ordinary people? Imagine being a child in the 1950s. You're sitting at your desk at school when a loud bell rings. Your teacher shouts, "Duck and cover." You dive under your desk, curl into a ball, and wait, as if a sheet of wood would protect you from the mushroom cloud. Schools issued dog tags to kids so that their bodies could be identified if a nuclear attack came. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. Governments printed guides not on whether a bomb might fall, but how to survive after it did. But do you think anyone of this would have worked? Let's rewind to where it all started. Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, a city of 350,000 people, was vaporized in an instant. Survivors described seeing a brilliant white flash, then nothing. Some closed their eyes, opened them again, and the world had vanished for them. One man recalled the moment his home collapsed around him, the bathroom disintegrating above his head. He wanted to scream for his mother, but the blast had taken his voice. Bodies filled the rivers. People's skin hung in shreds from their arms. The outlines of clothing were burned into flesh, and then came the rain. The black, radioactive, and fatal rain. 70,000 people died within an hour. By the end of 1945, the number had doubled. Just 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit. 80,000 more lives lost. President Harry Truman, after seeing the devastation, said the weapon should never again be treated as just another tool of war. But the momentum was already building. But as the Cold War deepened, Europe was too swept up in fear. Scientists, citizens, and peace activists held protests and debates, pleading with the leaders to consider the human cost of nuclear escalation. But as the arsenals grew, so did the tension. By the 1970s, public fear had begun to shift. People now feared not only nuclear war, but nuclear power, especially after the minor accidents raised doubts about its safety. Then, in 1983, something remarkable happened. A film aired on American television. It was called The Day After, and it changed everything. Set in Kansas, the film followed the lives of ordinary people. A doctor, a young couple, a military officer, all caught in the horror of a nuclear attack. Their daily routines turn into chaos as World War III unfolds. Set in Kansas, the film followed the lives of ordinary people, a doctor, a young couple, a military officer, all caught in the horror of a nuclear attack. Their daily routines turn into chaos as World War III unfolds. No superheroes, no miracles, just raw devastation. Over 100 million Americans watched it. Many were traumatized. ABC opened hotlines for viewers in emotional distress. President Ronald Reagan himself saw the film, and it actually shook him. He wrote in his diary that it had deeply disturbed him, stayed with him, and had haunted him. And just 2 years later, he made a bold public statement. But Reagan wasn't just preaching peace. He believed the US was militarily superior, and he wanted to negotiate from that position of strength. He hoped the Soviet Union might collapse during his presidency, but he also wanted a partner to make a deal with. At that time, in the Kremlin, a new figure was rising, Mikhail Gorbachev, young, articulate, and reform-minded. Gorbachev was exactly the kind of leader the world needed. He understood something vital: the nuclear weapons, while a symbol of power, were also an economic and humanitarian disaster. At one point, 20% of the Soviet GDP was being spent on nuclear weapons. Can you actually believe that? Meanwhile, his people were starving. Lol, what a joke. He saw an opportunity. If he could end the arms race, he could redirect those resources to rebuilding the Soviet economy. He also believed deeply that nuclear war must never happen. And then guess what happened? Chernobyl. April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded in the dead of the night, releasing radioactive material across Europe. The disaster was catastrophic. Unlike the West's reactors, the Soviet design increased in power when it lost cooling, a design flaw with deadly consequences. Children developed thyroid cancer, entire villages were evacuated. The exclusion zone, over 2,600 square kilometers, will remain radioactive for the next 24,000 years. The Soviet government tried to cover it up, but it was Sweden, not Moscow, that first alerted the world. Gorbachev was devastated. He later said that Chernobyl drew a line across his life, everything before and everything after. He met with Dr. Robert Gale, a Western doctor helping treat radiation victims, and made a decision. Nuclear weapons must be reduced. And then history shifted. On June 12th, 1987, President Reagan stood at the Berlin Wall and said, less than a year later, in May 1988, Reagan traveled to Moscow. He and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, banning intermediate-range nuclear weapons from Europe. The Cold War hadn't just ended, but the countdown to peace had begun, thankfully. So, what do we take from all of this? That fear, while powerful, can sometimes lead to understanding, that in the face of extinction, even adversaries can become partners, and that the survivors of Hiroshima, the children of Chernobyl, the viewers of the day after, all reminded us of what's at stake. The nuclear age is far from over, but thanks to the voices of reason and moments of clarity, the worst has so far been avoided.
The Ukraine conflict has reignited nuclear fears, what it tells us about global power dynamics, and what it could mean for the future of international security. Let's begin with a bit of history. Back in 1994, Ukraine had the third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, a remand of the Soviet Union. But in an unprecedented move, Ukraine agreed to give them up. Under the Budapest Memorandum, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia pledged to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and borders in exchange for its denuclearization. But fast forward to 2014, Russia annexed Crimea. Then, in February 2022, a full-scale invasion followed. This wasn't just a military escalation. It was a collapse of a promise. Some Ukrainian leaders have since questioned that decision. What if Ukraine had kept its nukes? This question is more than historical. It speaks to the very logic of nuclear deterrence. If you have them, no one invites. If you don't, you are vulnerable. Since the beginning of the 2022 war, Russian President Vladimir Putin has made a series of chilling nuclear threats, some direct, some ambitious. In March 2022, Russia placed its nuclear forces on high alert. Putin also warned that any interference from NATO could provoke consequences never seen in history. As seen in the PBS documentary The Bomb, nuclear signaling has long been part of military strategy. But today's signals aren't just bluffs. They come from nuclear superpower at war, making real-time threats. This tactic is known as escalate to de-escalate. The idea that the threat or use of a tactical nuclear weapon might stop a conflict in its tracks by terrifying the other side into backing off. But here's the risk. What if NATO doesn't back off? What if a misinterpretation leads to retaliation? As the documentary Command and Control remind us, accidents, miscommunication, and system failures can bring us to the edge even without intent. As the documentary Command and Control remind us, accidents, miscommunication, and system failures can bring us to the edge even without intent. Let's talk about the weapons themselves. Unlike strategic nuclear warheads that can destroy entire cities, tactical nuclear weapons are designed for battlefield use. Smaller yield, shorter range, but still massively destructive. Russia reportedly has thousands of tactic nukes. While there's no evidence of their deployment so far, the threat of their use looms large. While there's no evidence of their deployment so far, the threat of their use looms large. Military analysts warn the first use of any nuclear weapon, no matter how limited, could break the 78-year taboo since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That breach might open the door for uncontrollable escalation. The documentary The Fog of War, through the lens of former US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, remind us how close we've come before and how much human error, emotion, and miscalculation can influence nuclear decisions. The Ukraine-Russia conflict is not just about Ukraine, it's a global message, and the message dangerous. The war shows that nuclear weapons can deter even the most powerful adversaries. This could trigger a new nuclear arm race. Which are you ready for? If nuclear-armed countries are safe and these who disarm are vulnerable, why would any state choose disarmament? And undermines decades of work under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and other disarmament frameworks. Already, global trust in security guarantees is eroding. International institutions look weaker. Allies like NATO are being tested. Beyond the geopolitics, there's something deeper, the psychological tool. Millions of people in Europe and around the world now live under the renewed shadow of nuclear war. Fallout shelters, iodine tables, and radiation drills. These were Cold War relics. Now they are back in conversation, classrooms, and government plans. This fear isn't abstract. A nuclear strike, even a tactical one, would cause unimaginable human suffering, and the environmental damage would transcend borders. Radiation doesn't stop at checkpoints. The war in Ukraine has not just reshaped borders, it has reshaped our sense of nuclear security. It reminds us that nuclear weapons are not just Cold War leftovers. They are active tools of power, coercion, and threat, and it shows how fragile our global peace really is when it depends on men with launch codes. So what can be done? Greater investment in diplomacy, recommitment in international treaties like the NPT, real conversation about arms control and verification, and perhaps most importantly, a collective rejection of the logic that power must come from the ability to annihilate. Change won't come overnight, but without it, we are still living under the cloud of the last war and the next.
Nuclear weapons don't just destroy, they define power. The countries that have them are the ones that get hurt, that get feared, that get respected even when they shouldn't be. Since 1945, the world has been divided into those who have them and those who don't. It's like a global VIP club, a dangerous one. But instead of the membership card, there's a bomb capable of destroying the world. If you have it, you're here. If not, well, countries without nuclear weapons are often left in the shadows. And this isn't about technology. It's about strength. It's about political significance. It's about fear, armed respect. Take India and Pakistan, both nuclear powers, locked in a long-standing conflict. Tensions always high, especially this week. A full-scale war held back, for now, not by diplomacy, but by mutual fear. That's deterrence, and for some, it's the main argument for legality. We won't use it, but we have it, so stay away. But does that really make it legal? In 1996, the International Court of Justice faced a question that has divided experts for decades. Is the use of nuclear weapons legal under international law? In response, the court didn't respond. Each of the 14 judges had their own opinions. The president of the court had to cast the deciding vote in a 7-7 split, and that says it all. The final opinion? Using or threatening nuclear weapons is generally against international law. But, and there's the loophole, maybe not if the very survival of a state is at stake. Maybe the most dangerous word in law, because maybe often turns into yes. And that's the core of the legal debate. Are nukes only illegal if misused, or are they illegal in themselves? The court didn't settle it, and we still live in that legal gap between ethics, law, and the brutal logic of power. The world tried to bring order. In 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was born. Its pillars: no spreading, gradual disarmament, and peaceful nuclear energy use. But in practice, it cemented the divide. 5 countries, the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France, were allowed to keep their bombs. Everyone else asked to abstain. That's legal inequality written into the rules. This division into nuclear and non-nuclear states reinforces power asymmetry. If you have the bomb, you're a superpower. If not, even your survival might be negotiable. Ukraine knows this scenario well. After the USSR collapsed, Ukraine held one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. In 1994, it gave up its weapons, in exchange for territorial guarantees from Russia, the US, and the UK. But those promises didn't help in 2014 or in 2022. No nukes, no shield. No weapons, no security umbrella. So, is giving up nuclear weapons an act of peace? Or maybe a strategic mistake? Because in this world, a bomb isn't just a threat, it's insurance. And if you don't have your own, you'd better have a friend who does. Just ask Japan or South Korea, under the US nuclear umbrella. Protected. Indirectly, but protected. That gives them relative security, not through their own arsenal, but through someone else's. That's also power, shared but real. So here's the hard truth. Nuclear weapons don't just give you power, they give you leverage, allies, status. And not having them, that can mean being alone. In 2017, the UN introduced the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the first global document that says no nuclear weapons, a total ban, no testing, no threats, no possession, no exceptions. This no compromise treaty sounds ideal, right? Well, none of the nuclear armed states signed it. Not the US, not Russia, not France, not UK, China, even Japan, despite having experienced Hiroshima and Nagasaki, said no. Why? Because some see it as symbolic, detached from reality, too vague to work. Because law is one thing and power is another. Because maybe, just maybe, nuclear weapons, terrifying as they are, keep the peace. Because today the bomb isn't just a weapon, it's a symbol of fear, of force, of global rank. And it still splits the world into two. Those who have the bomb and those who have no voice. It divides the world into those who lead and those who follow. This isn't just rhetoric, it's the silent logic behind global politics. And nowhere is that more visible than in the war in Ukraine.
The mushroom cloud has become a symbol of horror and power, and though decades have passed since the last wartime use of a nuclear bomb, their existence continues to cast a long shadow over global affairs. This episode isn't about fear-mongering, it's about facing the reality of the modern nuclear landscape, understanding the historical context, examining the current threats, and questioning what role treaties, politics, and human agency play in all of this. The idea of controlling or even eliminating nuclear weapons has existed for almost as long as the weapons themselves. Ever since the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world has grappled not just with the unprecedented destruction, but with the terrifying realization that this might only be the beginning. And indeed, it was. The aftermath wasn't just limited to Japan. The years that followed saw dozens of nuclear tests across the Pacific, in Nevada, in Kazakhstan, and beyond, each leaving deep scars on people, landscapes, and generations. Yet, despite the horror and the haunting images etched into history, the global race for nuclear supremacy only accelerated. What started as a decisive show of military dominance during World War II soon became the central pillar of Cold War strategy. During those tense decades, the United States and Soviet Union amassed tens of thousands of nuclear warheads. These weren't just weapons, they became the scaffolding of the entire national security doctrines. At the heart of it was mutual assured destruction, or MAD. A doctrine so brutally simple it almost defies belief. If both sides has the capability to annihilate each other, neither would dare to strike first. It sounds mad because, well, it is mad. And yet, strangely, it worked. No full-scale nuclear war erupted. But we came very close. Very, very close. Numerous times. Technical errors, false alarms, and human miscalculations brought us to the edge. It's a miracle and perhaps a testament to human restraint that we're still here to talk about it. You might think that with the Cold War over, nuclear fears would have faded, that the urgency would have been replaced by cooperation. But here we are, well, into the 21st century, and the world still holds over 13,000 nuclear weapons. More than 90% of them are in the hands of two countries. Guess who it is? The United States and Russia. Yet, the nuclear club has grown. The United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, though it maintains official ambiguity, have all joined the ranks. And with every new member, the nuclear equation becomes more complex, more unstable, and far more dangerous for all of us. What makes today's environment especially alarming is a slow erosion. Some would say the outright collapse of the arms control architecture that once held these attacks in check. The anti ballistic missile treaty, gone. The INF treaty, dissolved. Even the New START treaty, the last major agreement between the US and Russia, is barely holding on and may not even survive beyond 2026. Meanwhile, modernization efforts are ramping up. Nations aren't just preserving their arsenals, they're upgrading them. New delivery systems are being tested: hypersonic missiles, submarine launched cruise missiles, and the disturbing rise of so called low yield tactical nuclear weapons. These blur the line between conventional and nuclear warfare. They make the unthinkable more thinkable. And it's not just about bombs and missiles anymore. Emerging technologies, AI, cyber warfare, machine learning have introduced new risks. Picture this: a cyber attack triggers a false alarm in a nuclear early warning system. Leaders have mere minutes to respond. Can they tell the difference between reality and deception? I don't think so. When decisions are made at the speed of algorithms, the risk of accidental war isn't just possible, it's disturbingly plausible. Add to this the shifting sands of global geopolitics. China is rising fast, no longer content with the doctrine of minimal deterrence. Beijing is expanding its arsenal: new silos, mobile launchers, sophisticated missile tests. This has sparked renewed efforts in Washington to match or surpass those developments. Meanwhile, the strategic triangle between China, the US, and Russia adds new layers of tension and miscalculation. And then there's India and Pakistan, a volatile duo with a history of war and ongoing border disputes. And as we talk right now, it's literally happening. Both are nuclear armed. Unlike the Cold War's bipolar stalemate, today's multipolar nuclear landscape introduces the real possibility that regional conflicts could spiral into a global catastrophe. And let's not forget about North Korea. Despite sanctions, threats, and failed diplomacy, Pyongyang continues to develop its arsenal. Nuclear weapons are more than just shields for the regime, they're bargaining chips and survival tools. And Iran, though not yet nuclear armed, remains a contentious player. The 2015 nuclear deal was a rare diplomatic victory, but when the US withdrew in 2018, the trust collapsed. Today, the path forward is as uncertain as ever. All of this points to a troubling truth. The global framework designed to manage and prevent nuclear proliferation is under serious strain. At the center of it all is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, that was signed in 1968. It rests on three pillars: non-proliferation, disarmament, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. In theory, nuclear armed states would work towards disarmament while others agreed not to pursue nuclear weapons. But in practice, disarmament has been indefinitely delayed. For many in the global south, this has created a perception of permanent inequality, a nuclear caste system, one might say, if you will, where some are forever allowed to possess the ultimate weapon while others are permanently denied. In response, a new treaty was born, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW. It was adopted in 2017 and entered into force in 2021. It's the first legally binding international agreement to comprehensively ban nuclear weapons development, testing, production, use, and transfer. But here's the catch: none of the nuclear armed states have signed it, lol, nor have their close allies. Critics call the treaty idealistic, unverifiable, even counterproductive. Supporters argue that all major treaties, chemical weapons, biological weapons, started as moral positions before they became legal norms. And yeah, they're right. Symbolism matters, especially when it comes to weapons that could end civilization. And amid all this debate, we risk losing sight of the most important element, the human cost. Nuclear weapons are not theoretical. They are not just chess pieces in a geopolitical game. They are instruments of indiscriminate death. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibukusha, have spent decades telling the world about the unimaginable horrors that they have endured: burned flesh, radiation sickness, lost families, psychological scars that never healed. Their voices are fading now, as they do, the danger grows that we will forget what's truly at stake. One modern nuclear bomb dropped on a city would kill hundreds of thousands in an instant. Fires, radiation, infrastructure, collapse would follow. Emergency services, if they survived, would be overwhelmed. And that's just one bomb. A regional nuclear war, say between India and Pakistan, could spark a nuclear winter. Crops would fail, temperatures would plummet, billions could face starvation. And this is not a hyperbole, it's science. And still, many nations cling to nuclear weapons as essential to national security. Deterrence remains the prevailing doctrine. But the very existence of these weapons increases the chances of their use, whether through miscalculation, escalation, or sheer madness. As former US Secretary of Defense William Perry warned, the risk of nuclear catastrophe is greater today than the height of the Cold War, and that risk is not being met with anything close to urgency that it deserves. So, what do? There are no silver bullets, but there are steps that we can take. First, arms control must return to the forefront of diplomacy. The New START Treaty must be preserved and expanded. China must be brought into trilateral terms and arms talks. India and Pakistan, they need confidence building measures, and they should have direct communication and mutual restraint. Second, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, signed but not ratified by countries like the US, China, and India, must finally come into force. A global ban on nuclear testing would make it harder to develop new, more dangerous weapons. Third, countries must adopt no first use policies. Committing never to use nuclear weapons unless attacked with them first reduces the risk of miscalculation and preemptive strikes. Fourth, civil society matters, guys. Movements like ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, have changed the conversation. They've pushed governments, raised awareness, and reminded the world that public pressure can move mountains. And finally, we must redefine what security means, for God's sake. True security does not come from power to annihilate. It comes from cooperation, resilience, diplomacy, and shared humanity. It's about building schools, not silos, curing diseases, not creating warheads, tackling climate change, not playing with nuclear brinkmanship. The nuclear age began with brilliant minds unlocking the secrets of the atom. Many of those same minds, Oppenheimer, Einstein, Szilard, later issued grave warnings about what we had unleashed. Now the question is, will we listen? Because the clock is ticking and it is later than we think.
We have two powerful movies like Oppenheimer and Watchmen that show us that nuclear weapons are more than military tools. They are actually symbols of science pushed to its limit. The bomb, which we thought was an exceptional invention that would only serve the urgency of the war, changed everything. The horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki showed the world that science had crossed the line, and we've lived in its shadow ever since. The Cold War turned the bomb into a threat, not a weapon. Power became about who could destroy the world first, and that fear still shapes our politics today. In the two stories, the bomb hunts its creators. Oppenheimer, for example, is consumed by his guilt, while Dr. Manhattan completely loses his humanity. Both ask the same question: what do we do with the power we can't take back? Because this isn't just history, it's now. As global tensions rise, the bomb still looms, and we still face the same question. Are we wise enough to control what we've created? That's the legacy, and that's the warning. It's ours to answer. Thanks for listening.